November 19th, 1944. Deep within the suffocating darkness of the Hürtgen forest, a place the German Lanzer had grimly nicknamed the Death Factory. The air, thick with the smell of pine, cordite, and wet earth, was punctuated by the rhythmic, metallic cough of an MG-42 and the splintering crack of American artillery shells detonating in the forest canopy. For Unteroffizier Klaus Richter, a veteran sanitator of the 275th Infantry Division, this sound was the metronome of death. He knelt in the freezing mud, his hands working with a desperate, practiced futility on a young grenadier, a boy of no more than 18 whose face was a pale, sweat-slicked mask of shock. Shrapnel from a tree burst had torn through the boy's thigh, severing the femoral artery. Klaus's tourniquet, cinched as tight as his exhausted muscles could manage, was a dark, sodden failure. The blood, black in the gloom, pulsed weakly from the wound, pooling in the mud and steaming in the cold. The boy's breathing was shallow, his lips blue. His eyes, wide with a terror that was fading into a vacant calm, stared up at Klaus. He was bleeding out, not just from the wound, but from within. His body was collapsing, his blood pressure plummeting. Klaus had morphine to dull the pain, sulfur powder to stave off infection, and bandages to cover the wound, but he had nothing for the core injury. He had nothing to replace the life force seeping into the German soil. He had no way to stop the hemorrhage. This was the brutal, unchangeable calculus of his trade. He could patch holes, splint bones, and offer a comforting word, but he was powerless against the invisible enemy of traumatic shock. He could only watch as the boy's life ebbed away, another number in a ledger of loss that was growing impossibly long. The German Medical Corps, in which he served with a weary pride, was an institution built on a foundation of harsh realism. It was, German doctors believed, the finest in the world, staffed by surgeons whose skill was forged in the crucible of Poland, France, and 4 years of apocalyptic warfare on the Eastern Front. They had perfected the art of damage control, of rapid, life-saving surgery in rear-echelon field hospitals. Their doctrine was one of ruthless efficiency: stabilize the wounded, evacuate them quickly, and let the master surgeons in the lazarets perform their miracles. But this doctrine had a fatal flaw, a gap between the front line and the operating table that was an uncrossable chasm for men like the dying boy at Klaus's feet. For a soldier dying of blood loss, the surgeon's scalpel might as well have been on the moon. The German medics, veterans of 100 brutal battles, never knew there was another way. They had accepted this limitation as a fundamental law of war, as unavoidable as the pull of gravity or the terror of an artillery barrage. They had watched thousands of their comrades die from wounds that were technically survivable, if only they could have held on. They had been taught that what happened inside a man's veins was a matter for God and the surgeons, far from the chaos of the front. They were about to learn that the Americans had repealed that law. What the German Lanzer couldn't comprehend, what their own high command had disastrously underestimated, was that the Americans didn't fight the same war. The Germans waged a war of tactical brilliance and fierce battlefield prowess. The Americans waged a war of logistics, of systems, of overwhelming industrial logic. The German soldier was a warrior. The American soldier was the endpoint of a vast, continent-spanning supply chain. German officers had initially laughed at this. They saw the American GI with his pockets full of candy bars, his seemingly endless supply of cigarettes, and his clean socks as soft, pampered, and unsuited for the grim realities of total war. They had seen the newsreels of American civilians back home, donating blood in comfortable, sterile clinics, and dismissed it as propaganda, a sentimental gesture with no real bearing on the front lines. A blood transfusion was a delicate, complex procedure requiring refrigeration, careful typing and cross-matching, and the sterile environment of a hospital. The idea of using it on a battlefield was ludicrous, a fantasy. It was a perfect example, they thought, of American naivete. Their laughter died in the mud of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes. It was there, they discovered, that the Americans didn't just bring more tanks, more planes, and more bullets to the fight. They brought life itself, bottled and packaged by the same industrial might that produced their Sherman tanks and B-17 bombers. The moment of revelation often came with the shock of a successful counterattack. A German platoon, exhausted and running low on ammunition, would overrun an American position, perhaps a battalion aid station set up hastily in a shattered farmhouse or a deep dugout. Bursting in, expecting to find chaos and dying men, they were met with a scene they couldn't believe. It was a scene that defied all their experience of warfare. They saw American soldiers, grievously wounded, lying not in silent, pale-faced resignation, but with a strange calm. And from their arms ran thin rubber tubes, connected to glass bottles hanging from rifle butts jammed into the dirt floor. Inside these bottles was a golden, amber-coloured fluid, being fed directly into the veins of men who, by all rights, should have been dead or dying. German medics who witnessed this were stunned. They stood frozen, their minds struggling to process what they were seeing. It looked like a hospital procedure, something from a clean, quiet ward far from the fighting. Yet here it was, just yards from the front line, administered by ordinary medics in the middle of a battle. They had never expected this. To them, it was a miracle. It was as if the Americans had brought a fountain of youth to the battlefield. What they were looking at was not whole blood, but something even more revolutionary: dried blood plasma. This was the symbol of America's true, terrifying superiority. It was a weapon more demoralizing than a 1,000-bomber raid, because it struck at the German soldier's core belief in his own hardened, superior endurance. The story of this battlefield miracle began not in a government weapons laboratory, but in the mind of a brilliant African-American surgeon, Dr. Charles R. Drew. In the late 1930 seconds, Drew perfected a method for processing and storing blood plasma. By separating the liquid plasma from the red and white blood cells, he created a substance that did not need refrigeration and, crucially, could be given to any patient regardless of their blood type. It was a monumental breakthrough, but the true stroke of American industrial genius was the next step: freeze, drying the plasma into a stable, powdered form. This transformed a perishable medical fluid into a rugged, portable commodity, no different from a K-ration or a box of ammunition. The standard US Army plasma kit was a marvel of practical design. It consisted of a sealed can containing 2 bottles. One held 300 cubic centimeters of distilled water. The other held the powdered plasma, the dried essence of a pint of blood donated by a civilian thousands of miles away. A simple tube and needle assembly was included. To use it, a medic simply had to add the water to the powder, shake it to dissolve, and in less than a minute, he held a life-saving intravenous solution. He could stop traumatic shock in its tracks. He could stabilize a horrifically wounded man, keeping him alive long enough to reach the surgeons who could save him. For a German medic like Klaus, accustomed to the grim powerlessness of watching men bleed to death, the sight of this simple kit was a professional and existential shock. He had spent years learning the hard lessons of the front, learning to accept the unacceptable, and here, in the hands of his enemy, was a simple, mass-produced device that negated all that bitter experience. It told him that his own government, for all its talk of warrior spirit and technological prowess, could not provide him with the one tool that mattered most. The Americans could. He was surprised not just by the technology itself, but by the sheer, breathtaking scale of its deployment. Captured American supply depots revealed not dozens of these plasma kits, but thousands upon thousands, stacked in crates alongside shells and grenades. German intelligence officers, interrogating captured American medics, listened in disbelief as the prisoners described the system. They spoke of a Blood for Britain program that had sent plasma overseas even before America entered the war. They described a nation of 130 million people mobilized in a vast voluntary effort, with millions lining up to donate blood. This blood was then moved to processing plants, packaged into the kits, and transported across a hostile ocean by a logistics train of staggering efficiency. It flowed from the veins of factory workers in Detroit and farmers in Ohio, across the Atlantic, into depots in England, onto landing craft, up the beaches of Normandy, and into the hands of a medic in a foxhole in the Hürtgen forest. The Germans, whose own supply lines were being systematically shattered by Allied air power, could barely comprehend such a feat. Their own nation was being bled white, its resources stretched to the breaking point. The idea of a parallel, life-giving supply chain operating on an industrial scale was beyond their imagination. It was a demonstration of a depth of resource and a national will that they were beginning to realize they could never match. That simple glass bottle, filled with rehydrated plasma, became a terrifying symbol. It was a symbol of an enemy that valued the life of a single soldier so much that it would move heaven and earth and mobilize an entire nation's scientific and industrial base to save him. For the German soldier, it was a profoundly demoralizing revelation. It suggested that their own lives were more expendable, that their own high command viewed them as mere cogs in a machine, easily replaced. The American GI, the boy they had dismissed as soft, was backed by a system that would go to impossible lengths to bring him home alive. As German casualties mounted in the brutal fighting of late 1944, and as their own medical supplies dwindled to almost nothing, the presence of American blood plasma on the battlefield became a source of grim battlefield legend. Stories spread through the German ranks of wounded GIS, who should have died but were instead walking and talking minutes later, revived by the miracle fluid. They were stories that chipped away at morale, planting a seed of doubt that would grow into a tree of despair. The war, they were beginning to understand, would not be won by the side with the bravest soldiers or the most brilliant generals. It would be won by the side that could master the cold, hard mathematics of life and death, by the side that had found a way to pour life back into its wounded men as fast as the battlefield could take it away. German surgeons operating in their field hospitals were masters of their craft, accustomed to working miracles with limited resources. They could piece together shattered limbs, remove shrapnel from deep within a man's body, and innovate techniques under the most horrific conditions. They were proud men, secure in their knowledge that German medicine was second to none. But by the winter of 1944, they were confronted with a new and baffling phenomenon that they never knew how to explain. American soldiers were arriving at their captured aid stations and field hospitals in a condition that seemed medically impossible. They came in with devastating injuries, multiple gunshot wounds, limbs torn apart by artillery, massive trauma from mine blasts, yet they were alive. Their blood pressure was stable, their pulses were strong, they were conscious and lucid. According to German medical textbooks, according to years of battlefield experience, these men should have been dead on arrival, claimed by irreversible shock long before they ever reached an operating table. A German major, a chief surgeon with the 6th Panzer Army during the Battle of the Bulge, noted in his personal diary his utter astonishment. He wrote of 3 captured Americans, all wounded in the same bazooka attack on their half-track, who were brought to his hospital. All had compound fractures and extensive soft tissue damage. By his estimation, their chances of surviving the journey from the front were less than 10%. Yet they had not only survived, they were stable enough for immediate surgery. He couldn't believe it. He questioned a captured American medic, a young man from Pennsylvania, who simply explained that each man had received 2 units of plasma at the point of injury. The German surgeon was stunned into silence. 2 units. On the spot. The concept was so far beyond his own reality that it sounded like science fiction. His own medics were lucky if they had enough bandages. His hospital was desperately short of ether, and the Americans were performing battlefield transfusions as a matter of routine. This was more than a mere technological gap. It was a chasm in philosophy. The German war machine was built for aggression, for the swift, sharp shock of the blitzkrieg. Its medical doctrine reflected this. It was designed to cope with the aftermath of a successful, lightning, fast campaign. It was not designed for a grinding, protracted war of attrition where every soldier's life became a precious, irreplaceable resource. The American system, in contrast, was built for the long haul. It was a system that understood that the most valuable weapon on the battlefield was not a tank or a plane, but a trained, experienced soldier. Saving that soldier's life was not a matter of sentiment, it was a strategic imperative, and blood plasma was the key. It was the bridge between a fatal wound and a saved life. It was the tool that allowed the American army to recycle its most valuable asset, its own men. A soldier saved by plasma was a soldier who could return to the fight in a matter of weeks or months. He would carry with him the experience of combat, making him a far more effective fighter than any fresh-faced replacement. German commanders, reviewing casualty statistics, were forced into a grim realization. Their own casualty rates were not just about the numbers of killed and wounded, they were about the finality of those numbers. A German soldier severely wounded on the front line was, more often than not, a permanent loss to the Wehrmacht. An American soldier with the same wound had a fighting chance, not just to live, but to fight again. The Americans weren't just winning the war of production, they were winning the war of human conservation. This realization had a chilling effect on the German officer corps. They were men who had been raised in a martial tradition that prized courage and sacrifice above all else. But they were also pragmatic. They could see the simple, brutal arithmetic unfolding before them. They were trading permanent losses for the enemy's temporary ones. It was a war of attrition they could not possibly win. The humble plasma kit, therefore, did more than save lives. It attacked the very psyche of the German military. It was a constant, tangible reminder that they were being outthought, outproduced, and outsustained. Every time a German patrol stumbled upon the remnants of an American aid station and found the discarded glass bottles and rubber tubing, it was another small nail in the coffin of their morale. Those empty bottles were a testament to an enemy whose resources seemed infinite, whose ingenuity was boundless, and whose fundamental approach to warfare was proving decisively superior. The German soldier had been told he was the Übermensch, the Superman, capable of enduring hardships his decadent enemies could not imagine, and he had believed it. He had frozen and starved on the Eastern Front and fought with a fanaticism that had nearly conquered a continent. But now, in the forests of Western Europe, he was confronted by an enemy who didn't need to endure the same hardships because they had simply engineered them out of existence. While he was dying from a preventable condition, his American counterpart was receiving a life-saving infusion of science and logistics. It was the ultimate shock, a realization that his courage and sacrifice, however immense, were being rendered irrelevant by an enemy who had turned the very act of healing into a weapon of war. The sound of artillery and the crack of a rifle were the familiar sounds of battle. But for the German soldier in 1944, the most terrifying sight was the quiet, unassuming symbol of American power, a simple glass bottle of life, giving fluid, a silent testament to the fact that the war was already lost. The psychological impact of this discovery was a slow-acting poison that seeped into the very soul of the Wehrmacht. For the veteran Lanzer, the war had always been a contest of will, of endurance. He had been told, and he had believed, that his greatest weapon was his ability to suffer more than his enemy. He could march farther, eat less, and endure colder temperatures. This belief was the bedrock of his identity as a German soldier. The American plasma kit shattered that foundation. It demonstrated, in the most brutally intimate way, that the Americans were not playing the same game. They were not trying to outsuffer the Germans. They were using their boundless ingenuity and resources to eliminate suffering altogether. The German medics who were captured and put to work in American clearing stations were often the most profoundly affected. They were professional men, and they could not help but be surprised and deeply impressed by the system they were now a part of. They saw a chain of evacuation so efficient it operated with the precision of a factory assembly line. A man would be wounded at the front, stabilized with plasma by his platoon medic, then moved by a jeep ambulance to the battalion aid station. There he would receive more plasma, perhaps penicillin, and be triaged by a doctor. From there, another ambulance would take him to a collection station, then to a larger field hospital equipped for major surgery, all within a matter of hours. The German medics, watching this, couldn't believe the resources at hand. They saw mountains of supplies, sterile dressings, surgical instruments, anesthetics, and always crates upon crates of plasma. They saw American surgeons, working tirelessly, but without the desperate, haggard frenzy that characterized their own field hospitals. The Americans had enough of everything. They had enough doctors, enough nurses, enough equipment, and enough time, all because the plasma had bought that time for the wounded man. This abundance was a form of cultural shock. A captured German NCO, who had served 3 years on the Eastern Front, was treated for a shrapnel wound in an American hospital near Bastogne. In a post-war interview, he recalled his astonishment. It wasn't the medical care itself that shocked him most, but the small things. He was given a clean set of pajamas. A nurse gave him a Hershey's chocolate bar. He was given ice cream, something he hadn't tasted in 5 years. He saw a medical officer casually smoking a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, a luxury item rarer than an Iron Cross in his own army. This, he realized, was an enemy that could afford to treat its wounded soldiers not as damaged equipment, but as honored guests. The contrast with his own reality was staggering and deeply shaming. He knew that back in Germany his own family was subsisting on black bread and turnips. He knew that German industry, hammered day and night by Allied bombers, was struggling to produce the most basic necessities of war. And yet, here, thousands of miles from their homes, the Americans had created a bubble of impossible abundance. They had so much of everything that they could afford to be kind, to be comfortable, even in the midst of the war's most brutal fighting. This realization led to a dark and corrosive conclusion. Germany was not just losing a war, it was being crushed by a different century, by a future that it had no part in. The American plasma kit was a dispatch from that future. It represented a new kind of power, a power based not on conquest and martial glory, but on production, organization, and a profound respect for the value of the individual. German soldiers had been raised on tales of Teutonic knights and the heroic sacrifices of Frederick the Great. They were the inheritors of a warrior tradition. But what good was a warrior tradition against an enemy who could raise its dead? What good was courage when faced with an enemy whose logistics were so superior they bordered on magic? The strategic implications were something the German High Command never expected when the war began. In the early years, German combat groups, or Kampfgruppen, were feared for their combat effectiveness, built around a core of experienced, battle-hardened veterans. But as the war of attrition ground on, this effectiveness began to degrade. Every veteran lost was a permanent blow to the unit's institutional knowledge and fighting spirit. Replacements were green boys, poorly trained and terrified. An entire unit's quality could be gutted in a single bad engagement. American units, however, showed a shocking resiliency. They could suffer horrific casualties in a battle like the Hurtgen Forest or the siege of Bastogne. Yet a few weeks later, they would be back in the line, their ranks filled not just with new replacements, but with many of the same veterans who had been wounded. These were men who had been saved by plasma, patched up by surgeons, and sent back to their units. This ability to retain and recycle combat experience was a decisive, war-winning advantage. It meant that American divisions, over time, grew more effective, while German divisions inevitably grew weaker. The Americans were operating on a positive feedback loop of survivability and experience, while the Germans were trapped in a death spiral of attrition. The war was no longer a clash of armies, but a clash of systems. One system, the German one, was a closed loop, consuming its own men and resources until there was nothing left. The other system, the American one, was an open loop, constantly replenished by the full might of its continental economy and the scientific ingenuity that had produced miracles like dried plasma and penicillin. The German soldier at the front didn't need to read intelligence reports to understand this. He could see it in the sky, filled with enemy aircraft. He could hear it in the thunder of enemy artillery, which never seemed to run low on shells. And he could see it in the discarded medical supplies of his foe, a quiet testament to a power so vast and overwhelming that it could afford to waste more than he had ever possessed. He was a brave soldier in a dying army, a relic of a bygone era of warfare, confronted by an enemy who had turned the very science of life into the ultimate instrument of victory. The German medics had begun the war as proud practitioners of a respected art. By the end, they were little more than battlefield undertakers, forced to watch as their comrades succumbed to wounds that their enemies, with their little glass bottles of golden fluid, had rendered survivable. They were shocked, not just as medics, but as Germans, because they were witnessing the systematic, scientific dismantling of their entire world. By the spring of 1945, the German war machine was a hollowed-out shell, running on a volatile mixture of fear, propaganda, and teenage boys. The once mighty Wehrmacht had been replaced by the Volkssturm, the People's Storm, a tragic levy of the old, the young, and the unfit. For the medics assigned to these units, the term itself was a black joke. They were sent to the front with little more than paper bandages and a handful of aspirin, tasked with patching up children and grandfathers who were being fed into the meat grinder of the final battles. Their medical kits were a pathetic reflection of a nation on the brink of total collapse. There was no morphine, no sulfur, and certainly nothing as fantastical as a blood substitute. They were witnessing the complete and utter breakdown of the system they had once served with pride. It was in this final, apocalyptic twilight of the Third Reich, that the ultimate irony of America's medical superiority was often revealed. A 16-year-old boy, conscripted into the Volkssturm and given a rifle older than he was, would be grievously wounded in a pointless skirmish for a ruined German village. Lying in the rubble, bleeding out, he would close his eyes, expecting the same lonely, helpless death that had claimed so many of his comrades. But instead of darkness, he would be found by an American patrol. He would feel a strange prick in his arm. He would open his eyes to see a young American medic, his face grim with a professional calm, hanging a glass bottle from the barrel of his M1 rifle. He would feel a cool fluid entering his veins, a strange warmth spreading through his chest, pulling him back from the precipice of death. He was being saved by the very enemy he had been told was a degenerate barbarian, with a technology he never knew existed, a miracle his own leaders could never provide. For these German boys, this was the moment the war truly ended. It wasn't the surrender documents or the fall of Berlin. It was this personal, intimate act of being saved by an enemy who possessed a power that seemed almost divine. It was a power not of destruction, but of restoration. And it was more absolute and more convincing than any Tiger tank or V2 rocket. After the war, Allied intelligence officers at interrogation centers like Oberursel compiled exhaustive reports on every aspect of the defeated German military. The records revealed a consistent and startling theme. When high-ranking German generals and logisticians were asked to pinpoint the reasons for their defeat, they spoke, of course, of Allied air supremacy and the sheer weight of material. But many returned again and again to a factor they had completely overlooked: the American ability to preserve and return its fighting manpower to the battle. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, a man who had orchestrated the deepest German penetration in the Battle of the Bulge, remarked with a kind of weary admiration on the American logistical system. He noted that his own panzer divisions, once they sustained heavy casualties, were effectively finished as elite fighting formations. The Americans, he observed, seemed to regenerate. He couldn't believe how quickly their units, which his forces had mauled, could be reconstituted and returned to the line, often with the same corps of experienced NCOs and officers. He had been fighting an army that could literally raise its wounded. The full story was told in the final statistics. By the end of the war in Europe, the US Army had administered over 1.3 million units of blood plasma. It was a number so vast, so far beyond German capabilities, that it seemed to belong to a different kind of war altogether. Behind that number were hundreds of thousands of lives saved, hundreds of thousands of experienced soldiers returned to the fight. The German soldier had started the war as the most feared fighting man in the world. He ended it as a tragic figure, a testament to the fact that courage and tactical skill were no match for a system that had weaponized the very act of healing. The simple glass bottle of plasma was the ultimate symbol of this new American way of war. It was not a weapon forged in the fires of a foundry, but in the quiet, sterile laboratories of science. Its power came not from an explosive charge, but from the collective will of a free people who willingly gave of themselves to save their sons. It represented a truth the German High Command had never grasped. The greatest resource of any nation is its people, and the army that best preserves that resource will ultimately triumph. The laughter that had echoed in the officers' messes of Berlin in 1940, laughter at the expense of the soft, materialistic Americans, had long since fallen silent. It had been replaced by the quiet, efficient hiss of plasma flowing into a wounded soldier's veins, a sound that was, for the Wehrmacht, the true sound of defeat. The war was over. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12, and it had been defeated not just by bombs and bullets, but by the quiet, undeniable, and overwhelming power of a simple bottle of life.